This is a different kind of story. Not just one of injustice, not just one of pain, but one of a black community that stood up and said no. No to the mob, no to the rope, no to the lie that black truth didn't matter, that the accusation was the verdict. But black people's no was met with injustice. Our decision to stand up and protect, to defend, was met with a more powerful decision to crush and to stamp out. Because when black people say no to injustice, injustice always finds a louder answer. This is the third video in the series I've been doing on what happens when the law leaves us, when it abandons us, and not by accident, but by design. In the first video, I told you about Pink Barber, a black man rushed to the gallows in just 81 days, not by a mob, but by a courtroom. In the second video, I told you about Hattie McRae, a 14-year-old black girl whose life was taken by a man who wanted to violate her, and she said no. The law refused to hold him accountable. And in this video, I'm bringing you something different. A story where the law didn't just abandon black people. It hunted them. It criminalized their courage. It made their resistance illegal. And then it called that justice. This story is about an injustice that began with one black man and soon came to involve his entire black community. Now, before I tell you what happened, I first have to lay the groundwork for you and give you some history about McIntosh County, Georgia, and its black population. You cannot and will not understand this story, what happened or why it happened, unless you first understand the backstory. This information is crucial to this story, so give me a few moments to set the stage for you with some historical context. McIntosh County wasn't like most counties in Georgia. It was different, and that difference went all the way back to the end of slavery. When the Civil War ended and the plantation economy broke apart, the Cotton Kings faded. In their place rose timber and turpentine and naval stores. Those industries ran on black labor. But in McIntosh, black labor wasn't just labor. It was power. 80% of the population was black. In the town of Darien, over 1,000 of the 1,700 residents were black. And they weren't just workers. They were landowners, merchants, storekeepers, farmers, fishermen, and artisans. They owned their own homes. They ran their own businesses. One white newspaper at the time said that they were perfectly independent of the white man. And they didn't mean that as a compliment, because that independence had a source. And his name was Tunis Campbell. Campbell came down from New Jersey during Reconstruction, and he built something really radical. He didn't just register voters. He didn't just teach in freedmen's schools. He tried to build a black nation within the nation. On the Sea Islands off of Georgia's coast, Campbell took control of land abandoned by former slaveholders. He set up courts and schools, a local government. He called himself governor. And for a brief moment in time, he made it real. He didn't just hope the law would protect black people. He trained black people to do it themselves. He organized a militia of 300 black men, uniformed and armed. And that militia wasn't just for show. When white land speculators tried to force their way in, Campbell's men turned them back with force. They didn't blink. The federal government sent troops to remove him. The state brought charges. White planters offered bribes. He wouldn't back down. And when they couldn't buy him or beat him, they burned his home, tried to poison him, and threw him in jail. He got out and he left the islands, but he did not stop. He went inland to McIntosh County, bought 1,200 acres of land, built a farming cooperative, rebuilt his base. That's why this place was different. That's why McIntosh County was a political stronghold long after the rest of Georgia switched political parties. That's why white officials could never fully lock it down, because the memory of Campbell lived on, not in speeches, but in structure, in training, in community, and how black people organized themselves. Black people in McIntosh County remembered how to defend its own. And in 1899, when the law came for one of their best, they didn't hesitate. They got ready. Henry Delegal was from McIntosh County. We don't know much about his background. The records just aren't there to help us piece his life together. But here's what we do know. From court filings and news reports at the time, Henry likely experienced slavery. He was described as an older man in 1899, and given the amount of land, wealth, and standing he had, it's clear he came through bondage and built something lasting on the other side. He was married to a woman named Miranda, and together they had at least 3 children. 3 sons, 2 of whom were John and Edward, and a daughter whose name wasn't recorded. Henry was well respected in the black community of Darien. He was a leader, one who followed in the footsteps of Tunis Campbell. Like Campbell, Henry owned land, enough land that his area became known as the Delegal settlement. And he had status too. Reports said that he once served as a personal valet to William Clifton, Georgia's Secretary of State. And in the black community, he was more than admired. He was loved and cherished. But that same success made him a target. Because for white power in Georgia, a landowning black man with respect, position, and influence, that wasn't just inconvenient. That was dangerous. And Henry's standing would soon put his entire family straight into the crosshairs of white rage and state retaliation. The other family involved in this incident was a white family, the Wallaces. The head of the family was a man named James Troop Wallace. The Wallaces were a former slaveholding family. The 1850 U.S. Federal Census slave schedules show that the Wallace family owned 4 enslaved black people. By 1860, they had increased that number to 14 enslaved black people, ranging in age from 32 to 8 years old. The Delegals and the Wallaces were neighbors, but there was tension between the 2 families. Henry had wealth, and he had prestige, and I can only imagine for a former slaveholder family, this did not sit well with them and others in the community. And the Wallaces didn't just resent Henry. They tried to bring him down. Once, a nephew of James Troop Wallace tried to sell Henry a stolen ox. Henry reported it to the police and had the man arrested. This intensified the hatred for Henry by the Wallaces. After this, they did everything they could to try to get him arrested and thrown in jail. Tried to take everything they could from him. They made up all kinds of lies about Henry. Once they said he cut timber on someone else's land, but those charges never stuck. They tried other things, but they could never get him arrested. Henry was too respected, too well liked, and too well known. That was until 1899. James Troop Wallace had a daughter named Matilda. She was born in 1873. In 1895, she was around 22 years old, and she married a man named Joseph Hope. Something happened, and shortly after they married, Joseph abandoned Matilda. In July of 1899, with no husband around, 27-year-old Matilda came up pregnant. Now, this in and of itself was not the end of the world, but that was until she had the baby girl that she named Emma, who was mixed race and clearly had a black father. And as you can imagine, that caused problems. Now, initially, there was no real excitement around the birth of Matilda's baby. No black people were rounded up. No accusations were made. Over a month went by after the birth before the unjust turn happened. Remember, I told you that the Wallace family had a long-standing hatred for Henry, and after all of their failed attempts to get him arrested and taken down, the Wallaces came forward with their next move. And this time, it involved Matilda, her newborn baby, and an accusation that had cost countless black people their lives before. James Troop Wallace went to the authorities and said that Henry had violated his daughter, and he got her pregnant. He signed an affidavit, claiming that the act took place the previous winter, and he gave them a reason for why no one said anything sooner. He said Matilda had been afraid of Henry, that Henry had threatened her. But that explanation didn't make much sense. Not in the world they were living in. Because when white families believed a black man had touched a white woman, they didn't wait 30 days. They didn't file affidavits. They gathered the men, found the rope, and lit the fire. Now, if you've been watching my videos, you've heard me tell stories of black men who suffer horrific deaths at the hands of mobs for allegations just like this one. I told you about 2 black teenagers, lynched for chasing a white girl across a bridge during a prank. Another young black teen, lynched just for giving a white girl he worked with a Christmas card. So, you have to ask yourself, what's the logic here? What fear would the Wallace family have had about reporting the truth to the authorities? About reporting a crime the white communities routinely answered with a rope, often within hours of the accusation. When Henry found out what had been reported about him, he knew that his life and his family lives could be taken without a moment's notice, that the rope or the fire could be his next meeting. And he didn't want that. Not for himself, not for his wife, and not for his children. So he did something that many would have thought was crazy. Henry turned himself in to the sheriff. He wanted to avoid bloodshed, avoid a lynching, avoid the mob. He knew they would come for him, and he hoped by turning himself in, he could avoid them and their brutality. But even that choice, turning himself in, that wasn't safe. Because back then, the jailhouse didn't mean protection. It meant waiting for the mob to come through the front door with the sheriff's key already in hand. So Henry wasn't just trying to save himself. He was buying time. And outside of those jail walls, the people who loved him were already getting organized. Henry turned himself in to McIntosh County Sheriff Thomas Blunt. And almost as soon as he got there, Sheriff Blunt wanted to move Henry to Savannah. He said it was for Henry's safety, to keep him away from the mob. But black people in Darien were not having it, and did not believe that for 1 second. They had seen this scenario play out too many times before. A black man who was supposed to be safe in the jail, and somehow he ended up miles away, meeting a horrific death without a single shot being fired at the jail. Remember I told you earlier that this was a black community that believed in self-defense? Well, Henry's sons sprang into action. They knew the mob was coming for their father, so they quickly ran around and rallied together a large number of Darien's black men to protect him. The men armed themselves and formulated a plan to prevent any attempt to remove Henry from the jail. On August 22nd, Sheriff Blunt tried several times to remove Henry. Each time a black watchman who was assigned to cover the jail rang the bell at the Black Baptist Church. And every time that bell rang, over 100 black men descended upon the jail and surrounded it and stopped Henry from being moved. Now, notice, I said they stopped Henry from being moved. I didn't say they stormed the jail. I didn't say they took Henry from the authorities or secreted him away. I didn't say any of that, because that's not what happened. These men were not trying to break him out. They just wanted the rule of law to play out, for Henry to get his day in court, for democracy and due process, not Jim Crow justice to decide Henry's fate. The next day, Sheriff Blunt tried one more time, and the same thing happened again. The bell was rung, and black people rushed to Henry's aid, stopping what was sure to be his lynching. The sheriff demanded that they step aside. The black people gathered there to protect Henry said they were there for one reason and one reason only: to stop Henry's lynching. After this, the sheriff and others became convinced that violence and force would have to be used on the black people to stop their attempts to prevent a lynching. Now, notice this. The law was preparing to use violence not on a lynch mob, but on black people who only wanted the law to take its natural course: due process, fairness, and justice. That's Jim Crow at work right there. When it came to black people, the law was what he said it was. Your motives meant nothing to him. The sheriff could have asked those black men to stay and help him protect Henry, but that's not what he did. Black people standing up for themselves, that had to be dealt with. That had to be put down. And it had to be put down in the strongest and most violent manner. I need to pause for just 1 second, because what I'm telling you wasn't just about Henry. And it wasn't just about stopping his lynching. No, it was much bigger than that. In Georgia, between 1880 and 1898, there were at least 138 documented lynchings. And in the spring of summer of 1899, racial violence exploded. At least 19 black people were lynched that year. And that's just the ones they counted. Many more were beaten and terrorized by white cappers, a white vigilante group that traveled the state beating and driving black people off their land. It was open season. And before Henry was ever accused, black people in Darien already knew what happened when the mob got its hands on a black man. Just a few months earlier, it had happened to a black man named Sam Hose. I'm not going to get too deep into the story right now because I plan to come back to it in a future video. But here's what you need to know. Sam Hose was a black farmhand in Coweta County, Georgia. He defended himself after his boss, a white planter, attacked him during the dispute over his pay. The boss lost his life in that fight, and Sam fled. And almost immediately, the newspapers and the mob began spreading lies. They said Sam had violated his boss's wife, said he attacked their infant son. None of that was true, but it didn't matter. Sam was hunted and captured and lynched in front of a crowd of more than 2,000 people. But not just lynched, he was tortured and burned alive. The crowd took pieces of his body and passed them around like souvenirs. Special trains were run just to bring people in to watch the lynching. Now, this was not justice. This was a public ritual. And the black people of Darien knew it. They had just seen it. That's why they fought so hard. They weren't just defending Henry. They were trying to stop that kind of horror from happening again, right there in their own town, to a black man they loved, a black man they cherished. The black population of Darien came out and prevented Henry's lynching, but that would cost them severely. Because what happened next shows just how far those in power were willing to go to use the law to punish black people for trying to stop the law from being broken. After Sheriff Blunt was stopped from removing Henry, he and town officials realized they were powerless to act. The county had no militia, no structural way to respond. So Blunt and the mayor wired Georgia Governor Allen Candler and requested that he send troops immediately. Now, it's important to understand who Candler was. He was a former Confederate officer, a man who had fought to preserve slavery. And just a few months earlier, he had personally offered more than $1,000 in reward money for the capture of Sam Holes. Candler made no secret of his views. He believed lynching was a legitimate tool to control what he called black criminality. He didn't see black people in Darien as protectors. He saw them as a threat, and he was ready to respond. Upon receiving the distress call for help, Governor Candler quickly ordered 200 troops to be sent from Savannah to Darien, about 60 miles away. They were put on an express train just 2 hours later. With rumors flying and fears of black people taking over, the train conductors pushed the engine to its limits. It raced toward Darien and arrived shortly before dusk. When the soldiers arrived, they were met by a large crowd of black people, many of whom were armed. But remember, the black people were not trying to start violence. They were trying to prevent it. So they made no attempt to stop the soldiers or block their path. As the troops made their way toward the jail, Judge Paul Seabrook begged the crowd to stand down. He requested them to let the soldiers take Henry to Savannah, and he promised that Henry would not be harmed. At that, the crowd erupted into applause. They felt they had accomplished their goal. Henry would not be lynched. The troops, the sheriff, and the city leaders then took Henry from the jail and to the train without incident. Now, when you think about it, if you were one of the black people who came together to protect Henry, from where you were sitting, your mission was a success. Henry was protected. There was no violence. No one was harmed. Black Dariens were prepared to return back to their lives. But Jim Crow wasn't prepared to let this go. He required a pound of flesh, a tribute paid to injustice and racism, a sacrifice on the altar of brutality and mob rule. And that's exactly what happened. Because this was not over. Not by a long shot. The real offense wasn't violence. The real offense was unity. And not that they threatened violence, but that they didn't need to. That they stood together, armed, organized, and unafraid. The black people had defended their own and won. That was something Jim Crow could not forgive. So what came next wasn't about justice. It was about punishment. These black people had to pay. Jim Crow was going to show them just how much he admired and rewarded black solidarity. Almost as soon as the black crowd dispersed, city leaders began planning how to enact their punishment for violating the social and racial order. The following day, after Henry was removed, the sheriff had 35 black people arrested. He called them rioters. But that was not the end, only the beginning. There was another plan being set in place, one to deal with the Delegals once and for all. On August 25th, the mayor claimed he deputized a posse of men. Two of those men, Robert Townsend and Octavius Hopkins, were sent to arrest Henry's sons, John and Edward, for inciting a riot. Along with several others, they arrived at the Delegals' home around 3 o'clock in the morning. Now, I want to pause here, because depending on what source you're looking at, you might hear different versions of what happened. Some newspaper reports said that white men were just doing their duty when they were attacked. But the Georgia Supreme Court will later review this case, and what they described was something very different. According to the court, Townsend and Hopkins had no warrant, and they weren't properly deputized. They were, in the court's own words, just private citizens, armed and showing up at a black family's home in the middle of the night. John asked if they had a warrant. The men said no, and they demanded that John and Edward come with them. He told them that he turned himself in later that morning on the 11 o'clock train to Darien. They refused. Words were exchanged. John eventually agreed to go with the men, and he was going to put on some clothes. But apparently Townsend didn't hear this and forced his way into the house. John heard Townsend say that he had taken one life today and didn't mind taking another. Fearing for his life, John quickly grabbed his weapon. When he turned around, he saw Townsend moving toward him, with his weapon pointed in John's direction. John fired. Townsend was fatally struck. and Hopkins was wounded. After this, Sheriff Blunt once again wired Governor Candler and told him the situation was critical, that he needed troops sent to Darien at once. The next day, more white men were deputized. Black Dariens had seen enough. Sticking together and protecting yourself only works when the other side plays by humane rules, not the rules of Jim Crow. Black people knew what would happen next. They knew the playbook, and they didn't want to stick around to become Jim Crow's next victim. So most black people in Darien fled town and hid in the swamp. Now, even though many expected tremendous violence and bloodshed, something unexpected happened. The sheriff's posse wanted to exact revenge on the Delegals, wanted to execute them right there on the spot. But the militia commander, Colonel Alexander Lawton, he intervened. He requested that the sheriff stand down to allow the militia to take the Delegal sons into custody themselves. And the sheriff agreed. But there was one problem. His posse was already on the way to the Delegal home, so the militia raced to get there first. When the militia arrived, the mob was prepared to take out the entire family. Two of the mob members were brothers of the man who died, Robert Townsend, and they wanted blood. But once again, the militia was able to convince the mob to stand down. Henry's wife, Miranda, said she would surrender her sons only if the militia promised to protect them from the mob. The commanding officer, Colonel Lawton, assured her that her sons would not be harmed. Henry's two sons, 24-year-old John and 22-year-old Edward, surrendered and were taken into custody. But they weren't the only ones the officials wanted. There were still countless other black people hiding in the swamp, many of whom had helped to keep Henry safe. They could either come out or the sheriff and his posse would go in and get them, with force. And there would be no guarantees they'd make it out of those swamps alive. To avoid more violence, Colonel Lawton called upon 10 of the county's most notable black citizens, ministers, the editor of the black newspaper, the political and civil service leaders of that county, and he requested that they use their influence to calm the black community and encourage Darien's black residents not to inflame tensions. The group published a circular calling on black residents to obey the law, respect the militia, and help restore peace. After the circular went out, many of the accused rioters turned themselves over in the next 2 days. 58 men and 5 women were jailed, not for attacking anyone, not for committing any crime, but for trying to protect Henry from being lynched. So far, we've seen 2 movements of Jim Crow law in effect here. We've seen how he reacted when black people banded together to protect their own. We've seen his backlash. And now we're going to see how he ensured that black people never dared to stand up to him again. Because now it was time to prosecute. Judge Seabrook quickly convened a special session of the court on August 27th to deal with what they were calling the black rioters. The first of the 5 rioters were tried on September 1st. There were 12 witnesses for the prosecution and none for the defense. Sheriff Blunt testified that they were deterred from removing Henry by the crowd's presence and violent attitude. But he never said anyone touched him, never said anyone attacked him. Defense attorneys argued to the all-white jury that the black men who stood up for Henry had taken no action other than showing up. They committed no violence, harmed no one. The jury returned a guilty verdict after just 15 minutes of deliberation. As for the remaining black people in jail awaiting trial, Judge Seabrook was eager to enter the jail. He knew that trying every case would take too long, and the Delegal still had to be prosecuted themselves. So charges against 40 of the accused rioters were dropped. The remaining 23 were convicted and given exorbitant fines ranging from $250 to $1,000. That's about $10,000 to $40,000 in today's money. And on top of that, they were sentenced to 1 year in prison at hard labor. For those of you wondering why the charges were dropped, or maybe you're thinking Jim Crow had a heart, not so fast. Remember, Jim Crow was about injustice, but he was also about profit. And it didn't serve him to send every black person in town to prison. These black people worked in his fields, worked in his homes, cooked his food, cared for his children. He needed them, and they couldn't serve him if they were all in jail. He had already accomplished his goal. He sent his message that this is what happens when you step out of line. And while he did like brutality, he loved fear even more, because fear hanging over an entire black population was a more powerful motivator than locking up his entire workforce. Those unjust trials took care of the so-called rioters. Then it was time for the Delegals. Remember, Henry had been charged with violating Matilda Hope and getting her pregnant, and his 2 sons, John and Edward, had been charged with inciting a riot and for wounding one white man and taking the life of another. Henry's wife and daughter had also been charged. Henry went to trial first. We don't know exactly what was said or presented to the all-white, all-male jury, but we do know the outcome. The jury was unable to reach a verdict. 7 wanted to convict, and 5 wanted to acquit. A mistrial was declared. Henry was tried a second time, and this time he was acquitted. As for his sons, John and Edward, they were granted a change of venue, and their trials were moved to Effingham County. They were convicted of taking Robert Townsend's life and sent to prison for life. Henry's wife, Matilda, and his daughter, they were found not guilty. But that wasn't the end of John and Edward's case. Remember I told you that the Georgia Supreme Court reviewed what happened. That's because John appealed his conviction. The 2 men who came to arrest the brothers were never officially sworn in as officers, and the court said they were simply private citizens and could not legally make arrests in someone's home. John was granted a new trial, but at the second trial, he was found guilty again. As for Edward, some records say he was granted a new trial and later released, but I couldn't find any records to confirm that. What we did find were Georgia State Prison record books showing both brothers being logged in, and later another record showing just John being in prison. Before I close, I want to say this. Sometimes this work is difficult. It comes with challenges, and it requires me to wear both of my hats, the historian's hat and the lawyer's hat. As a historian, I rely on what's been written, the books, the articles, the news reports. But as a lawyer and as a law professor, I'm trained to interrogate the evidence, to question the record, to ask, who said this? Under what authority? And does the law agree? And that's exactly what I had to do here, because it wasn't the historical research that gave me the clearest account of what happened at the Delegal home. It was legal research. It was a Georgia Supreme Court opinion. And I found that opinion just a few hours before I sat down to record this video. And I had to stop, had to read it, had to understand it, because I knew I had to get this right. The people we talk about in these stories, they deserve that. They deserve the truth. They deserve accuracy. They deserve for us to tell what happened to them with care, with honesty, and with respect. And that's what I tried to do, every single time. We don't know what happened to Henry Delegal. After the trial, he simply disappears from the record. We don't know where he went or how the rest of his life unfolded. His sons, John and Edward, as far as we can tell, died in prison, on chain gangs, doing forced labor. And the land, the wealth, and the community that they helped to build, we don't know what became of it. All we know is the injustice. That's what the record kept. That's what survived. The system erased the rest, erased the people, the legacy, and the story. And that's why we have to tell it now. Some have referred to what happened in Darien in 1899 as an insurrection. I don't call it that, and neither should you. I like to think of it as the time when black people said no, not today. You can't have this man today, not Henry, not this father, not this neighbor, not this leader, not this man our children look up to, not him. You can't take his life. You can't destroy what he built. You can't do to him what you did to all the others, what you got away with. It was a black community coming together to say, we know you won't protect us, so we will protect us. We will stop you from dragging him from the jail, from using the rope or the fire. We will stop you, and we won't use violence, just our collectiveness, our solidarity. But here's the problem with that. Black solidarity was outmatched against injustice. Black people had a rock, and injustice had a cannon. During those times, victory was rarely a word used by black people, because Jim Crow would always snatch the strength out of the victory, out of the pride, out of the celebration. Not because he was stronger. Black people outnumber whites in McIntosh County. But Jim Crow had the law on his side. He had institutions. He had power. And because of that, it meant if you were black, you were going to suffer. All of this started with a false accusation, a lie. And because the law never protected black people from mob violence, black people had to protect themselves. And that caused more suffering, because now the law was weaponized against black people. Can you see the irony here? The very thing that was supposed to provide protection, redress, and safety was used to abandon, target, and punish black people. Because black people were seen as being outside the law. It didn't apply to us. It was only used against us. And that's why I'm telling you this story. The Delegal family in the black community of Darien did something brave. They knew the consequences, but they did it anyway. And what they did deserves to be remembered. It was the law that enslaved Henry and his family, that kept them in bondage, in chains, in subjugation. And decades later, it was the law that came for them again. Not as slaves, but as suspects, still owned, still punished, just under a different name. They didn't get justice 100 years ago, but we can carry their name. And that is a kind of justice, because memory is justice. And justice starts with telling the truth. In the next video, I'll be back to close out this series with another name and another story. Another example of what happens when the law leaves us. Now you heard from me, but I want to hear from you. Had you ever heard this story, and what did you think about it? Leave me a comment and let me know your thoughts.